Our special guests, Leon Wilds, Mayor Michael Wilds, two authors actually of books about immigration. We have Mayor Michael Wilds' book, Safe Haven in America, and then of course Leon Wilds' book about his experience with John Lennon and Yoko Ono as their immigration attorney, which you're going to hear a lot about today. So again, I just wanted to give them a round of applause and thank them for coming. I want to say a couple things before we do the video.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I also would like to mark the presence of my dear wife, Amy, my father-in-law, Robert, Nina Nanasi, the director of our library, our board. Actually, you're the director, she's the chairperson of the board. I just switched jobs. Mr. Kelly, who's also a member of our Board of Adjustment. Chris, who is, for all intents and purposes, my deputy and the biggest heart in the city of Englewood. All my dear friends and countrymen that are here, thank you.
And your ears.
This is a real treat for me. Dad and I have been... My kids changed my ringer. Dad and I have been on a bit of a book tour for the last 2 years, and he never hit the Englewood Library, and it's a real treat for me personally. I got into the business of being an immigration lawyer because I held this gentleman's briefcase, and I knew that I wanted to do that for the rest of my professional and personal life. It's a real treat for me not only to be his son, but to be a colleague. And this is a wonderful story. I'm going to take you back now in time. The year is 1970, 71, 72. The Godfather is the best film of the year. The airlines are now allowing you to inspect luggage. For the first time, they're screening people's luggage going on airplanes. In those days, you can actually smoke a cigarette while you're on the airplane. The national anthem of the United States is not the Star Spangled Banner, but all we are saying is give peace a chance. President Nixon gets elected. The amendment to the Constitution reduces the age of voting from 25 down to 18. There are 3 million voters now in America, in a world before Google, YouTube, and social media, that are now going to vote any way this famous Beatle points his thumb, either thumb up or thumb down. There are documents being written behind the scenes where people understand John Lennon, who had a conviction, could be deported from the United States, and a lot of political headaches can be averted. That's the background. But nobody will say this better than John himself. We're going to show you a little bit of a video that aired the night that John sadly was assassinated. And we're going to then go into a conversation with Leon Wilds, the author and a scholar in this field, and a case here that led to what's called the Lennon Doctrine. I, as a professor for the last almost 10 years, and Dad for 33 years, teaches it. It's codified now in all the immigration law books of our nation.
There we go.
Our lawyer's name is Leon Wilds, and he's not a radical lawyer, he's not a William Consul, nothing like that. We went to an immigration lawyer who knew about immigration, and he has really been surprised, because he worked in immigration for 15 years, he's really been surprised by some of the things that have gone on.
Richard Nixon felt that if John Lennon was to remain here with his immense influence on young people, that he might lose his re-election campaign. So as a result, he started an immediate deportation proceeding against Lennon.
Further we submit, the law does not reflect the human activities. It is a law that needs to be changed.
John asked me to publish wherever I could that people could apply for this special benefit that he discovered in this case. And I finally got around to writing the whole book that has just been published.
Now, you thought that all you have to do was pay the $100 fine, but then what happened?
Well, I did just pay the fine, you know, and that was the end of it. And it went in the papers, whoopee, and another pop star bites the dust, you know. And then I came over to America and just, with no particular decision, decided that I'd like to live here, you know. I came over for a visit or something, and I was always coming and going and coming and going. And Yoko had been educated here, and she was always going on with me about New York, you know. She finally showed me and walked me around. And I fell in love with it. We thought, get an apartment instead of staying in a hotel all the time.
Surely.
So the next minute we thought, hey, well, let's stay, you know, it's great. So we also had other complications going on. The show isn't long enough for it, about her ex-husband running away with her daughter, and there was court cases in Houston, the US Virgin Islands, and we had to keep applying for these visas, and after you're bust, it's suggested that you don't apply for 9 months, you know, and people now have problems getting in. Mick Jagger, Stones, lots of musicians, Paul, lots of people they have to sort of do a lot of ritual to get in before they can come and go.
Mhm.
So we tried to say, look, we have this big case, we need to come in, and there was always a hassle and a hassle and a hassle, and then they started trying to throw me out.
All right, so we're at the point now where it might be helpful to have Mr. Wilds, your attorney, present, just so that nothing is said that might prejudice.
Well, it's really in case you have a question that I can't answer. You know, they ask me what's happening with you, and I say, well, there's some paper went to some senator that called, and I don't know who.
All right, fine. You were told it might be a good idea to wait for 9 months before applying for citizenship? Or
No, this was after the bust in England, before applying to visit the United States, that it would be a cool idea. That's sort of, you know, it would be a cool idea.
What is your status in the country right now?
That's why Leon's here. What am I, Leon?
Well, John was charged with being deportable in the United States for being an overstay by a very interesting turn of events. The district director of the New York Immigration Service charged him with being an overstay after he gave him a 2-week extension of his time. And in the middle of that 2-week period,
He was here on visa, right? Did he
Yes.
overstay? Is that the position?
He had originally come in as a visitor, and he had a number of extensions. And then finally, the Immigration Service gave him a 2-week extension. And right in the midst of that 2-week final extension, they revoked the period that they had given him. And they declared that he had been here as an overstay for the week that he had been here with their authorization. And thus the Immigration Service created the very status that they charged him with being deportable for. We fought that deportation case, and a decision was finally rendered after about a year that he was, in fact, an overstay. Now, the essential problem in the deportation case and what lies beneath the surface is that the only way one can get out of it is either to ask permission to leave this country voluntarily and get out, which John was not prepared to do, or to apply for permanent residence status. And the law prescribes that any person who had ever been convicted of any offense, no matter how small, relating to the possession of marijuana, at any time in his lifetime and under any circumstances, cannot obtain residence. And so that what was happening when the government did this little routine of revoking his stay and charging him with being an overstay, they were locking him actually into a position where the only application he could make was one which they were pretty sure he could never succeed.
Which was?
Pardon?
The application that he would make would be one that he would
For
never
permanent
succeed.
residence.
Permanent residence.
Yes.
All right.
Now, we applied for permanent residence for John and for Yoko. We won Yoko's case, and she was granted residence. But John's case was denied. We went up on appeal before the Board of Immigration Appeals, and we lost there as well. And we are now before the United States Circuit Court of Appeals on the same issue. And basically, on that case, the issue resolves itself into whether or not what happened in England amounts to possession under our law, and whether what he possessed in England was actually marijuana under our law. You see, the substance which John was convicted of possessing, he pleaded guilty, was called cannabis resin. That's a generic term, and it includes a number of substances. We had one of our top experts in the United States, a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School, testify, and he gave the only expert testimony. And his testimony was that cannabis resin is not marijuana, and marijuana is not cannabis resin. Yet the Immigration Service came to the conclusion that it was marijuana. And finally, with respect to the possession aspect, our law in the United States is very clear with respect to possession. You cannot be convicted in this country for possessing an illicit substance unless it is clear that you had a knowledge as to the illicit nature of the substance that you have.
Mm-hmm.
In England, at the time of John's conviction, a law existed which had been uniformly criticized throughout the world, and which was later, in England, at the time of John's conviction, provided that the government does not have been uniformly criticized, that you knew the nature, and which was later
The other one restarted. Sorry about that.
Huh?
And
The other one restarted.
in England, at the time of John's conviction, a law existed which had been uniformly criticized throughout the world, and which was later repealed. And it provided that the government did not have to prove that you knew the nature of the substance whatsoever. So that if you possessed a bottle and you thought it had aspirin in it, and in fact if the aspirin turned out to be some serious drug, you must have pleaded guilty under those circumstances because there was no way out. And that actually was the legal situation that forced John into this. That's where we stand with respect to the immigration.
I know that this is not a set, excuse me.
I was just going to say, one interesting point was that when they started the initial case, they claimed that it was a local New York problem, and they also started the proceedings against John and Yoko. Well, halfway or a third of the way through the proceedings, or whatever the number is, they discovered that actually Yoko did not have any record in England, and also she had a green card by a previous American husband. So this local case that was just another case like any other alien, which is what they kept claiming, was not one of those cases. So then they suddenly had to find something else, which was this overstay business, which they pulled a fast one. And so they had to give Yoko the green card. And now, one of them, I think his name is Green, keeps writing to the papers saying they're still treating me like a normal citizen, a normal alien, right? Only on overstay, no longer mentioning about marijuana, the original normal reason I was being thrown out. And it's just interesting that the case keeps changing to suit them, you know?
I know that this is not a satisfactory question, but maybe you have a satisfactory answer for it. You know, when all of us were little, we were told, why try to be someplace where they tell you that you're not one? You know, you go to a friend's house and his mother says, hey, I don't want you around, you come home. You could live almost anywhere you wanted to in this world. And so, if you're getting hassled, and this does not in any way negate the incorrectness of the hassle, if it is your attorney says, why put up with it?
Because I like to live in the land of free, Tom. And also, if it is up to Joe Doe on the street, he either doesn't care about it, or he's glad to have an old people living here, you know? Now, if I get in a cab with a cab driver, there's nothing to do with music or anything. He'll ask me, how you doing? I hope you can stay. So on your average citizen either doesn't care or wouldn't mind me staying here. I like to be here because this is where the music came from, this is what influenced my whole life and got me where I am today, as it were. And I love the place. I like to be here. I've got a lot of friends here.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I want to be, you know? Statue of Liberty, welcome. I even brought my own cash.
Brooklyn Bridge, want to buy it?
No, you're the ones that buy our bridges.
There is another case which we haven't discussed, and that is our case against the government.
Oh, you've got one against them.
That's true.
Yeah.
We've gone to court on 3 separate occasions, but the action that I'm talking about is the Selective Prosecution Act. We had some information that the deportation proceedings against John were not normally brought. Certainly the procedure followed was not normal. And we had learned that rumors got to the Senate Internal Security that John had some idea, or was rumored to have some idea, of appearing at the Republican National Convention in 1972 and leading an anti-Vietnam War demonstration or the like. And that this information in the form of a memorandum was transmitted by Senator Strom Thurmond to the then Attorney General, John Mitchell, who may have at the time been sitting with the other hat as well as head of CREEP, Committee to
Re-elect
the President, the former President. And we understand that a series of memoranda led all the way down to the District Director in New York, and that the action he took was not as a result of John's immigration status, but rather as a result or an intention to prevent John from exercising constitutionally protected
What
rights.
are they afraid of you doing if you have permanent residence here?
I don't know. I think that when it was started, somebody didn't want me here, and now they probably don't mind, you know. It's just it's a bureaucratic thing. It's gone on, and how do we stop it? Maybe whoever makes the decision doesn't know whether they are politically right or what's going to happen if we suddenly stop now when we start. I mean, it's very sort of embarrassing for everyone, I guess. And I don't think half the people who have started are now having their own problems. Right? So, I don't know where I am. I know there's a different lot of people in charge of my case now, and I'm sure they're not as hot to get me out because they didn't even have the Republican Convention in San Diego, and I was not permitted to go there either. So,
I only had less than 1 minute left. You know, you've been a very low-key and very mild-mannered guest on this program, and yet I've heard you described as being understanding of that. These are people who
because one gets a reputation, you know? So one thing or another, whether it's true or false. Being an egomaniac means I believe in what I do and my art or my music. In that respect, you can call me that, you know? I believe in what I do, and I'll say it, you know? And otherwise, this is pretty much me, you know? Apart from being on TV. You know?
Well, you're one of the nicest egomaniacs I've ever met.
Oh, so are you, Tom.
What's that guy's name, the interviewer?
Tom Snyder.
Tom Snyder?
Yeah, Tom Snyder. He was alive. I think Tom Snyder passed away, but he was alive when John was killed, and they aired the show that night because it had aired. I think this had aired in 1975, and he was killed 5 years later. So we are here with John Lennon's immigration lawyer, and it's a particular treat for many of us that are Beatles fans. I assume that most of the audience appreciate the Beatles, and you appreciate the notion, thank you for your service to our fire department, and a lovely couple, hello. We appreciate the notion that there is no John Lennon in the world scheme. And a lot of the conflicts that we've had, it's now going to almost be 40 years since John was felled this coming December. Next December. So very important for us to take this decision. Dad, how long and why did you decide to finally write a book after 40 years?
I suppose I just wasn't satisfied with what had been done by the government since the case was over.
How were you introduced to John and Yoko?
I was brought down to their apartment when they lived here in the village, and was interviewed by them to see whether or not they would like me to be their attorney. I was brought by the manager of the Beatles, who was visiting the United States at the time.
What was that first meeting like?
Well, first Yoko appeared, and I was immediately impressed with how bright she was. She seemed to be a source of a lot of information about herself and him, and she was very clear in describing everything. Then John appeared, and he seemed very much involved in the technical stuff in the case, not like he seemed here. By this time, he had a lot of training.
Did you know who the Beatles were?
No, not really. I mean, I had heard,
Hold on, why? I don't know because
where I grew up in Pennsylvania, they weren't so well known, or at least my friends didn't know about them, and I didn't. I had heard the title Beatles, but I didn't realize what an important organization they were and their music.
an organization. Well, because you went to sleep at 9 o'clock at night, correct?
Of course, didn't everybody?
So, tell us about the first meeting. You went home, of course, you're running a law practice, you come home to your wife, and what happens?
Well, she says that my office called to advise her that I wouldn't be home for dinner because I was going out to meet some potential new heavyweight clients. I don't think I could even describe them as heavyweights because I didn't know how important they were on my way there. Eventually, I met them and I learned about how important they were. But what was clear after my first meeting was that they had no real idea of the seriousness and the nature of the case against them.
And you, of course, told your wife that you had gone to see who?
I'm afraid I said it was Yoko Moto and Jack Lemmon.
Okay, so that's evening one, spending hours with luminaries at the time, which would become the most bitterly contested deportation proceeding of our time. And he comes home at night. The next night he has a second meeting with John and Yoko and doesn't have the audacity to come home not knowing who they are, so he stops a cab driver and with long hair and says, "Who's John Lennon?" And the fellow turns to the side, pulls over and says, "John Lennon." John Lennon's one reason I have this long hair. Who's your most favorite performer? What did you tell the cab driver? Beethoven.
Oh, he wanted to know who I thought was an important musician. Well, I said Ludwig van Beethoven.
When you go to sleep at 9 o'clock at night.
He said he said that Ludwig van Beethoven was heard by a couple of 100,000 people, but John Lennon will be heard by the whole world and recognized as the greatest musician who ever lived.
And we heard in the video the brilliance of arguing that the statute restricted marijuana, and you proved that it was the root of marijuana, or as John said, it was better than marijuana, the hash, and that it was not deportable under U.S. law. You proved also that you needed to have the evil intent, the mens rea. It was planted drugs, and at the time, he didn't know what it was and pled guilty and should not have suffered removal from the United States. But tell us the other underlying family reason why John needed to be an American.
There was a child whose name was Kyoko, and she was the 8-year-old daughter of his wife, Yoko. Kyoko's father made a continuous effort to hide Kyoko from his mother and never gave her the opportunity to exercise her rights as the mother of this child. And that was a terrible situation. They had chased the father around Europe while he tried to avoid child, and it was a terrible thing to observe.
And that's one of the reasons why you had John and Yoko dress up in the same outfit and clothing, so that it would look like they were trying to separate a family. That's the reason they wanted to be here. Why did Richard Nixon, the President of the United States, want John out?
Well, essentially, John had made a lot of famous noise with respect to the United States presence in the war in Vietnam. And there was a huge following of young people who also opposed the war in Vietnam. They felt there was no need for the United States to keep pursuing that war, and that it had gotten to a point where 50,000 young Americans had lost their lives in that war in Vietnam. And President Nixon was not discouraged at all. He wanted to continue the war.
What was it like to represent John? What was the New York experience surrounding this?
He was a perfectly delightful person. Never a crossword, never a failure to acknowledge someone he was with. And he was loved by everybody, it seemed to me, that was in his presence. I would observe people who came to see him who he knew and many who he didn't know. And he was just a wonderful, extraordinary person.
For your information, Yoko and Kyoko were actually reunited later in life. Tell us about your personal relationship with John. What developed?
He was a very special person. He made it his business to know what was important to the people around him, and he just loved everybody. It's very hard. I don't have a million friends, but he made himself to be my closest friend for a number of years. He took an interest in the things that were valuable to me and showed an interest in all of the people around him. And he was extraordinarily talented. It was not unusual for him to delight those in his presence.
Your phones are being tapped by the FBI. John was being followed by what you described in the book as two people interminably fixing a bicycle. Tell us what you would do with your father.
Actually, one of the things I did with my father was I called him up and told him in Yiddish. My father was fluent in Yiddish, and I tried to be fluent. I explained a lot of what was going on to him, and I told him that it was likely that we were being followed. I was being followed, John was being followed, Yoko was being followed. And not only followed, but the moment the following had to stop, the same two guys who were following us would show up right behind us and continue following us wherever we were going.
But the plan was to have my grandfather, my Zadie, as they would say, actually start talking about John Lennon in Yiddish, and some old Jew then would end up getting paid to translate the service.
I thought it would be good for business for certain people who speak Yiddish. because they would need, the FBI would need somebody who spoke Yiddish to find out what terrible things Lennon and his lawyer were talking about.
All right, every third question you're drinking water because the sound comes out better. It's the microphone, of course. You had some interactions with another Beatle, George Harrison. George Harrison also needed the waiver because of charges, and I recall, and in the book, we memorialize or we chronicle all of the beautiful people that came to support John. Tell us about some of those people that stepped forward.
Well, you have to know a little about our history for this. I taught at Yeshiva University's law school, the Benjamin Cardozo School of Law, for about 33 years. And then I had to give up the job because it took up too much of my time to write this book. I felt that unless the book is written, I have no way to transmit all the things that the government still hadn't done to make up the violations of law against John Lennon. So, withdrawing from teaching, the school knew of Michael's abilities in teaching immigration law because he had helped me on a lot of occasions. And they called him immediately, and he succeeded to my position as the adjunct professor of immigration law at the school. Incidentally, the lovely young woman sitting in the front row is his wife, and he met her in my class. How's that?
I'd like two grandchildren.
And then what happened as after he was teaching a couple of years, two of his four beautiful children started going to law school, Raquel and Josh, and they just graduated recently. Both of them passed the bar, and I'm very proud of them, of all of his children. And we have gotten to a point here where they were graduating, and it's my custom to come to the graduation to a hood, to place the hood on the head of the graduate. And this time I really needed to be there. I had two graduates in the class, but there was somebody else who had a graduate in that class who was more important than I, and that was Paul McCartney.
Yes, that was
He's married to a lady who has a student in that class, and they were honoring him at the time. So I'm not a very important person, so I get to go to these graduations, and it's usually nothing more but than a lot of wonderful feelings on the part of a grandfather or a father. And on this occasion, my other son was with me. He's also a graduate and was my student. And as we walked into the room, he said into the auditorium, he said, there, 5 rows back, is of another Beatle. Paul is there. You know, I give them last names, but they're not so close to me as they are to the children. And so we walked over and I introduced myself to him very politely and shook his hand. And I said, I'm not very important, but I certainly was a dear friend of your colleague, John. Well, he said, oh no, I know who you are, you're very important. came to get him and take him to prepare him, and he got on the stage. And when he got on the stage, he started talking about how important the certificate that he got and the honor that he got from the law school. Because he said, this is the law school that helped another people. I never had any problem with your government in the United States, but my buddy did. And whenever he was in trouble with the government or had a legal problem, that professor in this school immediately came to help him, and he was helped all the way through. And so I felt like $1 million, aside from being very proud of my family on that occasion.
It was a real treat when Paul mentioned that. I was standing right behind him, and I was doing a videotape of my father when Paul McCartney mentions my father by name, and my father didn't hear properly, and my brother had to nudge him, and it's wonderfully available on YouTube. Other luminaries in the book are letters from the likes of Peter Sellers, Jack Lemmon, Fred Astaire, Andy Warhol. They were the world's greatest talents that we're trying to establish, not only that John was extraordinary, but and a feather in America's cap, but that if he were to be removed from the United States, it would have an immeasurable effect on our country. Tell us a little bit about our visit to Yoko's home about a year or two ago, the white piano, the culture of getting them prepared for trial, and the experience of dealing with them then.
I used to meet with them early in the morning of any hearing date, and I would go to their apartment and work out some kind of arrangement where they would be dressed. I supervised their dressing. That doesn't make me an important person, but it does comment on the importance that I had in the case, that these two people cannot be separated. The government was deporting each one separately. Actually, Yoko had either renewed her residence or didn't need it renewed. She was already a permanent resident when they put her through this terrible proceeding, charging her with being deportable.
But you would dress them in the same shirts and the same outfits, so that visually when they sat together.
Yeah, I wanted to be sure that everybody knew this was a couple and that they should not be separated. The trial attorney for the government was one of the best people they had, and I knew that he would do that because that's what I would do if I was in his position.
Anticipating what the trial attorney would do, developing a personal interest, and I understood also through our being brought up in a religious and observant Jewish household that he respected your Sabbath.
Without any question. One of the first questions I was asked that evening before I left them at their apartment, the first time I met them, was, can I have your telephone number? And that's when I have to explain to people that I don't answer my phone from Friday evening to Saturday evening. And usually it's just it's a pain for busy people. But here it was a very special kind of connection. They respected it. I remember receiving a call in Grossinger's when we were there for the high holidays. And I got the call before my boys are all dressed going down to services. And I have a telephone call and the operator says, some wise guy on the phone says he's John Lennon and wants to talk to you before Yontif.
So, Yoko never became an American citizen as its public record because she would have to renounce her Japanese nationality, and we have the privilege every 10 years of taking her and extending her green card. In the more recent visit, there was a beautiful white piano that reminded you of your experience with John and the piano.
I had a very limited experience with the piano, or music for that. Actually, when we were in their apartment, while we were waiting for John, I sat at the piano, and because you were taking lessons and your brother was taking lessons, I would, at the end of your lessons, take a short lesson with the same guy and stand for my invisible audience and take a bow. I really was not very good at the piano, but I did have a little experience at the piano, and so I started playing it while I think Yoko was in the room, and Yoko said to John as he entered, Leon is taking lessons and he can play the piano. John said, when Sean gets old enough, I'd like to take lessons too. Leon, he said, I never took lessons on the piano.
The case was in multiple theaters of federal court. You had the audacity to sue the federal government under the Freedom of Information Act, knowing damn well that if they weren't taking good choices and were doing this for political expediency, that there was a program in place. The notion of prosecutorial discretion had to have been documented. It was the first time somebody took that audacious effort, sued the government. You describe in the book that there was pure jubilation when 1,843 cases were sent into the office, showing that the government had deferred taking action against mobsters and drugsters and burglars for a greater good to avoid bad publicity and so forth. It was President Obama 40 years later that relied on this Lennon doctrine, on the notion of prosecutorial discretion to now protect almost 900,000 people. Known as the Deporter-in-Chief, President Obama woke up in the second part of his term, realizing that he had to do something, otherwise his legacy would not be respected for immigrants. What does it feel like to know that you, a scholar, John, a dreamer, a musician, put into motion a case that would then have an effect on nearly 1 million people?
It was something that I always was anxious about. We would go to, I represented the immigration bar in the New York area. We have a bar association. And in representing that bar association, I would appear before government officials, and everybody would always ask about why every person who has a deportation charge gets deported, and why can't you separate the bad from the good and deport only those who ought to be deported? And they lied and said that we don't choose. We deport every deportable alien. And they were lying through their teeth. It was terrible. Over, I'd say, 100 years, we accumulated a lot of people, and some of us old-timers in the immigration bar knew of some cases of people who were still here with no explanation whatsoever, and we were lied to
So imagine in the 1970s a president using immigration for the optics, for a political benefit, and yet another president in common day, in current day, doing the same. Before we open up the audience for questions, tell us about that fateful day and the experience of telling John and Yoko that you had won their case.
I recall it very vividly. I got a call in my office from a gentleman who said he's the clerk of the United States Court of Appeals of the Second Circuit here in New York. That's the case we had taken our main appeal to finally. And this was 5-6 years later already. I've been representing John all this time. And he said, Mr. Wilds, I'm not supposed to be doing this, but I'm calling you to tell you that you won your Lennon case. And he said, and if you would like to look at the decision, I'll make a copy for you if you agree with me right now that you won't reproduce it or publish it until the court does, because one of the judges is likely to come in and say he wants to change a few words in his decision. I said I'd be happy to do that, and I'm sending somebody down for it now, and I'll agree not to make copies. I called John, and he answered the phone with a high-pitched, feminine-sounding voice. The way which was the only way he would speak on the phone, because our phones were all tapped. My phone in the office and at home, how dangerous it is for a lawyer's phone to be tapped for himself and for his clients. We knew that John's phone was tapped as well, and any of the other important people around had the same clicking sounds and so on, and tested it and found out that those phones were being tapped.
So he called you to go down to the hospital.
He said Yoko is in the hospital now, and she should be giving birth either tonight or tomorrow morning. She's at New York Hospital, and he said, I said, well, I'm going to have a copy of the decision. Oh, he said she would love for you to read it with her.
Did you tell them how the judges voted?
And I told him as well that the judges voted. I said, they told me that the chief judge and one of the other judges, the 2 Jewish judges, voted in your favor, and the Irishman voted against you.
So you go down to the hospital. Yoko's on the eve of giving birth. Did you come alone? Did you bring anybody?
No, sure. I called, and he put Yoko on the phone, and she said, bring Ruth. That was Michael and Mark's, my wife. And I brought my wife along, and after I sat with Yoko for almost 2 hours.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but in the meantime, everybody who's a doctor or a nurse or a medical intern is coming in the room. We had that experience in the office. Anytime John would come into the office, there would be 8 coffee cups, because everybody made an excuse just to walk into the room, and he would just put it down in front of everybody. That was the kind of traffic they got in their private life. So what happened?
So your mom said at the time that she's getting a little uncomfortable. We should really leave. And John turns to Yoko and says, can I tell him now? Can I tell him now? She said, okay, tell him. Well, he said, you know that there were all these other lawyers trying to get the case. And I found out that Yoko's tarot card readers, she has 6 of them, they voted unanimously for you to keep the case. They said, keep Leon, he's going to win the case.
All right, so now you let them to their own designs, and then what happens later that night?
John, when there's some news, call me. And the best luck to you and Yoko. And we went home. And then in the middle of the night, I don't know, I'm usually better answering the phone in the middle of the night. But this was a difficult one. And I said, who is this? He said, it's John Lennon, and I have a beautiful boy. That much I heard.
That was a very special day. What were the 3 things that happened on that day?
Well, actually, it was John's birthday, the father of the child's birthday, and of his child's birthday. A very, very special day, and he had learned that he won his case. Essentially, what the Court of Appeals held was the reversal of all the issues in the case and the approval of all the requests that I had made. The decision was read by your students, the students in the class I spoke to yesterday.
Big treat for those students, and a big treat for scholars in the future to see what the efforts of one lawyer, one technician who toils in an area. One of the reasons the Bar Association wanted to publish your book when they saw a drop in the enrollment in law school is to encourage people to go into a field, and the advice that Dad gives in the last 9-10 years that I'm teaching to the students is to what, Dad?
Well, to dig into the cases that they have, not look for bigger ones or fancier ones, and study those cases and do the best you can for those clients.
You can see how inspirational he can be as a father and as a lawyer. He writes still with a pencil because he is practicing law. He hasn't perfected the profession, and reminds us always to do the best and to do a deep dive, even into the most difficult challenges. If you buy the book, you'll hear a lot more anecdotes and stories. You'll see how contemporaneously John and Yoko picked up a beautiful white handkerchief and then declared the state of Newtopia, asking for diplomatic immunity at a press conference. Dad did a recording in that very room about a year ago for the Decades or This Happened There show. In the back of Yoko's kitchen is a little brass plate, and it says Embassy of Newtopia, and it's been left there for a term of endearment. The experience of running a practice and keeping this famous case alive is a culture unto itself, and of course, if you're a Beatles fan, this is one of the must-read books. Dad speaks often at conferences and lectures on the subject. We'd be happy to entertain some questions now if anybody has. Feel free to step forward or step up. Yes, ma'am.
I love the Beatles, and they're definitely my generation. I used to play this album like Rubber Soul about 50 million times. But anyway, I went to John Lennon's funeral in Central Park. I remember that? They had this huge happening. It really was a happening.
It's a vigil.
Yeah, I mean, because we called it a happening. I mean, millions of people just showed up in Central Park to mourn his passing. It was unbelievable. And then at one point in my career, I moved to St. Louis, Missouri, and people said, why are you moving to St. Louis, Missouri? It's such a conservative place, but I went for my career. Anyway, in my office, I had a poster of John and Yoko, and my conservative Midwestern voice boss didn't like it, and one day when I was on vacation, he came in and he took it down. There was a lot of nerve, but anyway, what could I do? He was the boss, so he didn't. I think they were like lying in bed or something. I can't remember, but it was kind of it was a poster of John and Yoko Lennon in their big bed. He took it down. So anyway, these are some of my memories, but I remember distinctly. I'll never forget going to that happening service because I went with my friend's husband and she was pregnant, and he wouldn't let her go because he was afraid, it would be so crowded there that something could happen to her.
There was do you want that to comment on the vigil and the whole
Sure,
experience?
if you
What was
need
it
it.
like for you personally, and where were you when you found out that John had been shot?
I was on a vacation in, forget the island.
Aruba.
In Aruba, right. I have a mental block because the hotel didn't let you get messages. And as a result, I was on a blanket with my wife getting sun when we heard somebody talking about the killing. And it was a terrible shock. And Yoko is still very close to us. Every 10 years, because Japanese can only have one citizenship. If she applies for, she'll lose her American citizenship to get the Japanese back. So as a result, it's
Yeah, she
trying every 10 years that we get together to renew her American citizenship.
yeah, so she gets her green card every 10 years.
And what about the son,
She
Sean?
can't become an American citizen.
Sean's an American.
Sean's an American citizen.
Because he was born here.
He was born here, yeah. Yes, sir.
So she was a legal permanent resident, but there was some issue about it in the book as to whether or not they accepted that ultimately. Did
So-
they really accept that she was a
The
legal permanent?
government was convinced, and she thought that she had lost her American residence and citizenship at that time when she left the United States without the child. Actually, you don't lose the American citizenship, the green card.
Yeah, let me clarify if I can. So, Yoko is a green card holder and a citizen of Japan. She cannot take on U.S. citizenship without then losing her Japanese nationality, so she remains with a green card. At the time they discovered that she had a green card, you can lose your green card by operation of law by being out of America for a full year. I don't believe she was out for a full year and may have been under the mistaken notion that she may have lost the green card by certain actions that she did take or didn't take. But the pursuit of getting a green card was brilliantly and strategically set up. That each one would apply for a green card, and it appealed to Yoko because she had her own talents independent of John. And if there were two separate applications and each one was bringing their spouse in independently, then the acknowledgement that Yoko herself, despite his conviction, was significant enough to get a green card would include him in that effort. So that visually would have them actually wear the same clothing, the same outfits, have them hold hands, and made applications, and those applications, as you read in the book, sat pristine in safes while the shots were being called in Washington by politicians who were playing with the optics of all of this. We still have a very puritanical view when it comes to marijuana, despite the advent of medical and the use of recreational marijuana, the lack of movement in the world of expungements. The country is still trailing as far as it's moving into more progressive territory and more just territory. There's a great interest in Hollywood now in everything 70s, and this is taking on a great interest. And there are movie deals and book deals, and there is a feature film that we're negotiating right now. You wanted years ago to have Paul Newman play you. Now, who is it that you, if you had a choice, would want to have play Leon Wilds in the movie?
I choose George Clooney. Why not?
Now, there are a couple of television movies. There are 3 films that depict the case, the U.S. versus John Lennon, Lennon NYC, the Tomorrow Show, they're all on DVDs. But the Ballad of John and Leon, a scholar and a dreamer, is something that we are here to honor. That's going to stay for a little while for everybody to get to know. Is there any other one question before we go forward? Yes.
I'd like to make a comment. Being a baby born just after John Lennon's death, I did not realize just how important his impact would be on my life years later. But as an individual who grew up because of my mother's influence with the music that she had when she was a child, seeing the Beatles and everything, and because of the dedication of this human being who always believed that what he was saying was true, to give peace a chance for every single person, I am very fortunate today to live in a time when, if we ever need to take on important issues, such as the things we're dealing with now, with such darkness in this world, we need to dive deep and realize what John Lennon was saying was absolutely true. We must stand firm and not let our own democracy die in the darkness. Because if we do not act now, they will win. It is our moment. Rabbi Hillel said it best. If not for myself, who will be? If not for others, what am I? And if not now, when? It is our time to keep John Lennon's dream alive more than ever.
Good design.
Well said. Very well said.
Well, Avi Mori, my dear father, and everybody that's here, we continue to do the work that we do, and I tip my hat to you for your stewardship and your love and your talent. Thank you.